Chapter 21. Shifting Momentum. The Reaper watched his opponent with something like reverence. He took an involuntary step back, realizing what he'd done a moment later and shoring up his stance. Meanwhile, Jo lowered her weapon to her side and sent more soul into it. She swung the blade in a haphazard upward diagonal and slung that soul off its edge in a single directed wave that shimmered like a shadow cast upon a shifting curtain. As it advanced, it actually disappeared and reappeared further along its path rather than simply moving quickly, bearing down on Jo's opponent in less time than it took to blink. The Reaper tried to smoke step out of the path of the attack, but Jo bore down on it with her will, urging it to follow him. She was pleasantly surprised when it shifted position, as Jo did when she shadow stepped, and did just that. The Reaper assumed his smoke form at the last moment, and the wave of soul passed right through him, fell, and bore through the ground for well over a dozen feet before finally dissipating. Meanwhile, the Reaper reformed in place and grasped at his chest. His aura didn't reform. Blood soaked the front of his shirt. He stumbled, sickly green soul crackling along his body like spidery little fingers. Jo marveled at the weapon floating just past the tips of the fingers of her offhand. It was so thin that she couldn't see the blade at all when looking at the edge directly. She was astonished by just how natural it felt. She was well aware that her ease in forming it had been little more than luck, that trying something like this again would still be a huge risk until she had finished her training. But now that the soul shear was formed, it really did feel like a part of her, as if it had always been there and she would miss it when it was gone. It was different from the soul shear that Wilson had shown her, more resembling the kind of sword that Jo imagined she might favor. It weighed nothing, and Jo felt her soul interacting with it directly. When she moved it, it seemed to shimmer into and out of existence. She felt compelled to send her soul into the blade and exert her will upon it in different ways. She wasn't quite sure what doing so would accomplish, and yet her instincts told her that it would be beneficial to find out. She looked at her opponent again, watching as his latest wound closed a bit more with each passing second. Even through his smoke form, Jo's soul shear had managed to do more damage than Jo had ever done to him before, even while he was solid. Wanting to push him further, Jo followed her instincts, willing the soul in the blade to refract off of itself. Most of the blade's total length shattered into many knife-sized splinters that floated together in a roughly blade-like shape. Intuiting how her weapon would function in this form, Jo gestured at the Reaper with the weapon's jagged, stumpy base, and the blade fragments followed the gesture, pointing at him as well. Amused by just how completely the tables had turned, Jo willed the soul shear fragments to spread out and then launched toward the Reaper like bullets, replicating the pattern of the Reaper's own attack. Recovering from his surprise, the Reaper reacted to Jo's latest assault with speed and expertise. He smoke-stepped rapidly, avoiding one blade after another, each and every one of them sailing harmlessly past him. Undeterred, Jo charged at the Reaper, brandishing the stump of her weapon. The loose fragments flashed out of existence, and Jo felt their energy rush back to her soul shear, regrowing it to its original length, just as she came upon her target. Jo thrust with her blade, but the Reaper sidestepped it. She slashed with it, but the Reaper ducked back out of her reach. She pressed her attack, shadow-stepping right up in his face, but he reacted quickly, smoke-stepping back an equal distance. Reaching out with smoky tendrils, the Reaper plucked two of his knives from the ground. He snatched them back out of the air just as Jo lunged at him again and slashed across the width of his torso. He pumped the knives full of soul, letting them catch Jo's soul shear without breaking, parrying her attack, striking back immediately. Jo, who had far less experience with weapons, chose to shuffle away, avoiding the Reaper's counter rather than clash with him directly. "I didn't expect you to know that technique," the Reaper remarked, he and Jo circling each other, each looking for a sure opening in the opponent's guard. All amusement had disappeared from his tone. The air of lofty confidence that he'd projected since he had first appeared to Jo in the Dueling Hearts and the Mega Dojo was gone, and Jo could practically feel him amping up his level of concentration. Fighting fatigue and a creeping faintness, likely caused by her copious loss of blood, Jo felt compelled to act before she was ready. She fought back that desire, faced with the reality that, soul shear or not, she was still in worse shape than her opponent. She was fighting on what amounted to borrowed time. If she didn't attack, if she didn't actively probe for an advantage, her opponent would beat her through attrition, but that didn't mean she could be reckless. Stressing her body almost to the limit, Jo willed her energies to mix, recreating her aura. It was shaky and weak, but it still doubled Jo's speed, and the moment the aura formed around her, she shadow-stepped toward her opponent and put that speed to immediate use, swiping at him relentlessly. Based on what Wilson had told her about the soul shear, Jo only needed one good strike across her opponent's body to defeat him. If she just let go of the idea of doing physical damage and focused on striking his soul with the blade instead, she could burn him out as he had her mother. Even a glancing blow could weaken him enough to make a difference. The Reaper, without an aura of his own, only barely avoided one strike after another, making liberal use of his own weapons to do so, but it wasn't enough. The soul shear clipped his left shoulder, passing through it almost as if it weren't there, leaving a shallow cut and black and purple static that caused the Reaper to flinch, racked with excruciating pain. The Reaper smoke-stepped away from Joe, as far as he could with just one quick use of the technique. He raised his knives, his left arm shaking noticeably, and smoke-stepped rapidly around Joe, moving as quickly and as irregularly as he could, shaking even Joe's well-trained eye. Joe sent her life energy out in waves, trying to get a ping off of the Reaper's own energies, but before she could, she felt an explosion of soul as the Reaper recreated his aura as well. Anticipating an attack to come, and left with no reliable means to see where it would come from, Joe took a page out of the Reaper's book again and shadow-stepped rapidly in place. When the Reaper lunged at her, slashing wildly with his knives, he only nicked her arm rather than cut her across the torso as he'd intended. Meanwhile, the minor injury gave the Reaper's position away. Joe turned without even looking and drove her knee into the Reaper's side. He stumbled, but he recovered quickly, conjuring up a pool of smoke beneath his feet, lifting himself up far above the ground. Joe jumped up after him, but he simply swayed gently out of the way, letting her fall back to the ground and aggravate her injury. She would hesitate to do that again, buying himself a few seconds to think of something. As she touched her wound gingerly, however, Joe remembered something else that Wilson had told her about the soul shear. She lunged this time at the pillar of smoke itself, at its base, and slashed. Her soul shear passed through the smoke, through the soul that made it up and gave it its properties, and disrupted the latter. The smoke dissolved away, and the Reaper fell out of the sky, landing hard on his back. Joe pressed her attack, taking advantage of the opening that she'd won, but at the last moment the Reaper leapt back to his feet, steadied himself, and deflected her blade with another desperate close-quarters parry. This time Joe couldn't retreat. The Reaper's defense had left her open and off balance. She had just enough time to likewise deflect his counterattack, and the two began to clash, blade to blade. Joe pushed herself as hard as she could, fighting against her own lack of experience, but she could feel her opponent pulling ahead of her. She began to slip, missing opportunities to shadow step, swinging too wide with her blade, even outright stumbling. Her opponent exploited those openings, cutting Joe on her arms, her cheek, and across her chest. Joe knew what was happening. She couldn't fight it anymore. Her shirt was soaked. She'd simply lost too much blood to keep going. Desperate, she drew back from the Soul Taker, putting as much of her aura as she could into her legs, launching herself back at him with all the speed she could still muster. She leaned into her advance, raised her soul shear, and thrust it shakily at the Reaper's shrouded face. She expected her opponent to parry the attack, or avoid it, or become smoke again and cushion himself from the damage, but he didn't. Instead, as Joe drew close, he sent as much of his sickly green aura as he could up through his arms and into his knives, and he caught Joe's blade between them. As powerful as he was, Joe was still stronger physically, and yet he held her at bay, and he twisted. In her weakened state, Joe couldn't do anything as her soul shear shattered, its shards falling toward the ground, disappearing before they reached it. Joe couldn't believe it, and the Reaper took advantage of her surprise. He swung his arms back, leveraging himself forward, and jumped up, driving both of his feet into Joe's abdomen. She was launched backward, tripping, tumbling head over heels, rolling to an eventual painful stop. For a few long seconds, she didn't move. "I'm almost sorry to do this," the Reaper said as Joe struggled just to get her arms beneath her torso. "But you don't seem like the type to ever give up, and I'm short on time." He smoke-stepped once, leaving a puff of smoke in his wake, appearing above his opponent in an instant. His knife was already on its way down, aiming to pierce her through her center back. Joe could hear her friends shifting in place, moving to intercept the Reaper's attack and save her, but as touching as that was, it wasn't actually needed. After all, Joe had succeeded in getting her hands beneath her torso, but not so she could push herself back up. Using the last of her strength, she flipped herself onto her back and swung her palms around to aim at her opponent, revealing that, floating just beyond her hand, was a swirling orb of soul the size of a basketball. It came off as desperate as Joe slung the orb feebly at her opponent. If the Reaper had been any further from her when she did, it would have missed him spectacularly. But as close as he was, he didn't have time to avoid it. He assumed his smoke form, and the ball of soul passed right through him, spinning, dragging the smoke that was the Reaper behind it, pulling him up and away from his target. That's when Joe sprang her trap. The swirling orb, which looked like a soul breaker, was actually something else entirely. Rather than a dense, destructive ball of soul, Joe's attack was loose, good for little more than moving the air. From her place lying in the gravel, Joe opened her hand as wide as she could, willing the ball of soul to expand. It did, displacing the Reaper's smoky body. Then Joe clenched her fist and willed the ball of soul to collapse again, compressing down to a size so small that it could barely be seen. It shrank so quickly, spinning so rapidly that it pulled the smoke along with it, drawing it all into one place, forcing the Reaper back into his physical form. The Reaper was stunned, the shock of being forced out of his smoke form leaving him disoriented and falling freely through the air. Joe had plenty of time to push herself shakily back to her feet and reignite her aura, gasping, biting back pain as she formed her actual Soulbreaker this time, and sent it flying. The entire process took only a few fractions of a second, and then the blast was upon the Reaper. He never even saw it coming, taking the blast directly in the chest, racking his tired body with the force of a speeding bullet train. He was knocked back violently, crashing into the concrete wall of the second of the two unfinished buildings, cracking it on impact. It wasn't the strongest Soulbreaker that Joe had ever created, but it was enough. Her opponent collapsed, and he didn't rise. Breathing heavily, Joe willed the last drudges of her soul to mix one more time with her life energy, causing both to spike. With visible effort, she wrapped herself in that new life energy, surrounding herself in a weak, healing aura. Immediately, she felt the burdens of the heart-to-heart begin to melt away. She heard movement behind her, and suddenly the other dueling hearts were there with her. "Is he dead?" Sarah asked, looking at the place where the Reaper had fallen. Something told Joe that her sister wouldn't have minded much if the answer was yes. "No," Joe replied. "An attack like that isn't enough to finish someone who can heal as fast as he can. I wasn't even sure if it was going to be enough to knock him out. I'm lucky it was. I really didn't have anything else in me." "The important thing," Karen said, stepping right up to Joe's side, so close to her that their shoulders were touching, "is that you did it. I was worried for a while there, but you pulled it off anyway somehow." She chuckled. "I barely know you, but I'm already catching on that that's kind of what you do." Joe felt her cheeks grow hot. As her wounds closed and her strength returned to her, it began to sink in what, exactly, she had managed to accomplish. The Reaper was an opponent who, only days ago, had been a threat to Joe and Karen together, and yet today, Joe had beaten him alone. She met Karen's gaze and smiled cheekily, saying, "I guess I am pretty badass." "Yeah, okay, we're happy to all still be alive," Lawrence snapped from his place at the back of the crowd, forcing his way forward, getting in Joe's face. "But in case you forgot, you risked my life and the lives of the only two people I actually like to get information from this guy. You had better damn well get it." Joe hadn't forgotten, but hearing it said out loud spoiled her good mood. She looked at the Reaper, lying there unconscious. She wanted to walk away, to leave him there to suffer, but the simple fact was she wasn't like the Reaper. She wasn't the bringer of death, and she didn't want to be. Despite everything the Reaper had done, Joe couldn't leave him in this state, and that still would have been true even if she didn't need him conscious and talking. "Kimmy," Joe said, her tone commanding, "I'm betting that he has an unnatural soul, so his healing options are limited. I know you've been learning healing from my mom. Can you do anything for him?" "I have a technique," Kimmy replied hesitantly, "that Shannon helped me develop. I can sync up my life energy with someone else's and heal them, even if they have an unnatural soul. Not nearly as well as I could someone with a natural soul, but it's possible." "Good," Joe told her. "Then get to it." Kimmy hesitated, looking from Joe to the other dueling hearts. Lawrence wasn't even standing near them anymore, pacing around like he was trying to keep from punching someone. Monty didn't look like he knew what to think. Jen stood off to the side, looking down at the ground, ignoring the conversation for some reason known only to her. "Are you sure about this?" Sarah asked, voicing Kimmy's question for her. Tucker looked Joe right in the eye and asked, "Yeah, seriously, did you somehow not see what that guy just did to you? I mean, sure, you got the cool laser sword thing now, but he beat that. Who knows what he'll do if he gets back up?" "Kimmy," Joe instructed, "just get him talking." Joe sounded sure of herself, as if she knew something that the others didn't. So Kimmy did as she was told. Joe watched as she knelt down beside the Reaper and held her hands out over him. Light soul built in her palms as she concentrated, straining as she curled her fingers, weaving a conduit of soul for her life energy to cross, and then straining even harder to sync that energy with the Reaper's so that it wouldn't be rejected by his body. Meanwhile, as Kimmy did her work, two figures watched from a building shadow nearby. One carried himself with the gait of someone old and frail, leaning upon a sturdy oak cane. Even beneath such a thick veil of darkness, more than a cursory glance at the man would reveal himself to be Mr. Wilson. Next to him stood a slim, feminine figure in a loose blouse and a long skirt with a cut down the side. She was massaging her wrists, as if she'd been recently restrained. Even in the low light, only a blind man could have missed her smile. "I can't believe it," Shannon remarked, her voice radiating pride. "I guess that soul shear was your doing?" "Yeah," Wilson confirmed with a slight chuckle. "When she told me that Reaper kid had the ability to become almost entirely intangible smoke, I realized that the soul shear might be the only way for her to damage him in that state. I knew it was a risk, but you knew she could handle it," Shannon said, completing his thought. She wasn't sure if it was the choice that she would have made, but she didn't feel like it would be fair to argue with Wilson so soon after he had managed to find her and free her from the place where the Reaper had hidden her away. "I didn't expect her to be so proficient with it, though," Wilson continued. "Her form wasn't perfect, and she's still lacking control, but she worked out how her soul would interact with the blade entirely by instinct. And then she didn't even end up defeating her opponent with it, relying on her own ingenuity and techniques to do the job. She really is so much like him." "Yeah," Shannon agreed in a melancholic tone. "She really is." She smiled. If we're not careful, she'll surpass us both before we even know what's happening. They all will, Wilson remarked in disbelief. I've never seen so many fighters with so much potential all in one place. He glanced at each of the dueling hearts in turn, scrutinizing them. What's really remarkable, he added, is that they don't seem to draw their power from the ancient soul fragments, but rather their talents only fuel their soul's potential. Shannon looked over at Wilson. You say that like everyone in their group has a fragment of the ancient soul. She let the statement hang in the air like a question. Wilson met her eyes, and though he didn't say anything, Shannon's demeanor changed enough that it was clear that she had perceived his answer. She looked again at Joe and her companions, as if she were seeing some of them for the first time. As she did, the Reaper finally began to stir. More of his sickly green soul crackled along his body, and he braced himself against the ground, rising suddenly but shakily to his feet. The dueling hearts stepped back, putting some space between themselves and their enemy, in case he took this opportunity to resume his attack, but there was no need to worry. As soon as he stood, he toppled and dropped to one knee, bracing himself against the ground. He looked up at Joe, and even though she still couldn't see his face, she could feel his eyes upon her. Well, he said, you won. I guess that means I owe you something. You do, Joe told him, but I was kind of hoping that you might be willing to do a little more. Thing is, if you haven't already guessed, we plan to take down your organization. The problem is, we aren't really sure how to go about it. If you help us, if you tell us everything that you know, it'll make things a lot easier for everyone. You have got to be kidding, Lawrence said with a laugh. There's no way this guy'll tell you anything. He's their leader's right-hand man, his personal enforcer. That's why I'm betting he will help us, Joe replied without looking at her teammate. To the Reaper, she said, I'm betting that, being your leader's right hand, you've seen more of what he's capable of the shitty stuff he's done than anyone else. Thing is, we know that a lot of guys in your organization wouldn't be there if they had another choice. The more I think about it, the more I figure that fighting your leader could mean hurting a lot of those guys, too. If you have any sympathy at all for your fellow soul takers, then tell us everything you can. It may end up saving lives. The Reaper didn't say anything. Joe couldn't tell if he was considering her request or not, but she decided to give him the benefit of the doubt and wait. She could practically taste the tension and the uncertainty in the air. None of her companions were convinced that this was a good idea, but Joe didn't care. Something told her that this person would help them, if he was given the chance. She continued to wait, and the others, reluctantly, followed her lead. Then, finally, after several long, tense seconds, the Reaper sighed with his entire body. It was as if he had set down something incredibly heavy. He leaned back against the concrete wall behind him, reached up, and slowly lowered his hood. Joe was shocked, not because the rogue hunter's appearance was inherently surprising, but because it was so decidedly not. In that moment, Joe wasn't really sure what she had been expecting him to look like, but what she saw wasn't it. The person who Joe had come to know as the Reaper was just a kid. He was probably about Jen's age, but he looked even younger. He had a handsome but soft face, blonde hair, and bright blue eyes. He looked almost completely normal. The only details that stood out as unusual were the unevenness of his hair, as if he cut it himself and didn't care what it looked like, and his expression, which was so hard and sharp that when he looked at Joe again, she flinched. I guess, the Reaper said, at this point, I don't have anything left to lose. After all, like most soul takers, I have my own reasons to want to see our leader defeated. That's probably where I should start. He looked each of the dueling hearts in turn and said, My real name is Max, and this is the story of how our leader took my life.